What started as a simple rose garden would ultimately cost an HOA board $15,000 in damages and tarnish the reputations of 3 people forever. Margaret Chen, a 67-year-old retired librarian, had been lovingly tending her backyard roses for 12 years when she found a violation notice in her mailbox. The demand? Rip out every single bush or face $50 daily fines. But Margaret had no idea this wasn't really about landscaping rules. This was about greed, corruption, and a vindictive neighbor who thought a senior citizen would never fight back. She was wrong. Dead wrong. And by the time the courtroom drama was over, the HOA president would be banned for life. Her husband's business would be ruined, and Margaret would become the most famous grandmother in Arizona. But how does a flower garden lead to a federal investigation? Margaret Chen never imagined that moving to Arizona would change her life, but at 62 years old in 2008, she was ready for a fresh start. Her husband of 38 years had passed away 6 months earlier, and the memories in their Chicago duplex had become too heavy to bear. When her daughter showed her a listing for a house in Sunny Meadows, a planned community just outside Phoenix, Margaret knew she'd found her sanctuary. The house itself was a modest 3-bedroom, 2-bath home, with nothing fancy. But the backyard took Margaret's breath away. A 1/4 acre of empty desert soil stretched behind the house, facing perfect southern exposure. For a woman who had dreamed of growing roses her entire adult life, but never had the space, it was like finding buried treasure. Margaret had always been the type of person who read every document before signing. The HOA rules, property deed, restrictions, and community guidelines, she studied them all with the same methodical attention she'd once given to cataloging library books during her 30-year career. The landscaping section was crystal clear. Homeowners could plant flowers, shrubs, and decorative plants in rear yards without approval, provided they maintained a neat appearance. Perfect. Within her first month, Margaret had sketched out elaborate garden plans. She researched Arizona's growing zones and consulted with master gardeners at the local extension office. She even hired a landscape architect to ensure proper spacing and drainage. This wasn't going to be some amateur weekend project. Margaret approached her rose garden with the same precision she'd once used to organize entire library systems. By spring 2009, the first roses had been planted. Heritage varieties that could handle the desert heat. Climbing roses for the back fence. Hybrid teas are in carefully planned color arrangements. Margaret spent every morning at 6 a.m. in that garden, coffee mug in hand, talking to her plants like they were old friends. Because in many ways they were. Those roses had gotten her through the loneliest period of her life. The neighbors loved it from the start. Kids would peek through the fence gaps to see what Margaret called her rainbow garden. The climbing roses created a living wall of color that could be seen from 3 houses away. In 2015, Margaret won the community's Beautiful Yard Award. She won it again in 2017. The little ceremony at the community center, where HOA President Jim Mitchell handed her a small plaque, remains one of her happiest memories in Sunny Meadows. For 11 years, Margaret's routine never changed. Morning coffee with the roses, evening watering sessions, weekend pruning and fertilizing. She knew every bush by name, could tell you which varieties bloomed when, and had detailed notes about each plant's quirks and preferences. The garden had grown into something spectacular. 47 rose bushes in peak condition, some reaching 8 feet tall, creating a private paradise that brought joy not just to Margaret, but to everyone who saw it. Margaret became one of those neighbors everyone loved having around. She baked cookies for new residents, volunteered at community events, and always had a kind word for the mailman. Her house was the one with the perfect garden that made the whole street look better. When people gave directions to Sunny Meadows, they often said, "Turn at the house with the incredible roses." However, in early 2019, Margaret began to notice changes in the community dynamics. Jim Mitchell, the longtime HOA president who had given Margaret her gardening awards, decided not to run for re-election. The annual HOA meeting in March had unusually low attendance, with only about 30 people in a community of 847 homes. Most residents, Margaret included, barely paid attention to HOA politics. The dues were reasonable, the common areas were well maintained, and everyone generally got along. The new board slate ran unopposed. Karen Westfield, a local real estate agent, was elected president. Two of her allies, both newcomers to the community, filled out the board. Margaret didn't think much of it at the time. New leadership might bring fresh energy to the community. Karen lived directly behind Margaret, though they'd never been particularly close. Karen's backyard was a standard desert landscape with gravel, a few small shrubs, and very low maintenance. The two women had exchanged pleasantries over the fence a few times. Still, Karen always seemed to be in a hurry, her phone pressed to her ear as she discussed property listings and market conditions. What Margaret didn't know was that Karen had been trying to sell her house for 8 months. The listing had started at $445,000 and had already dropped twice. Potential buyers kept making the same comment during showings. The neighbor's elaborate garden made Karen's sparse backyard look boring by comparison. One couple had actually told Karen's listing agent they fell in love with the neighbor's roses, but thought Karen's yard looked like an afterthought. Margaret also didn't know that Karen's husband owned a landscaping company that had been struggling to find consistent work. Desert Bloom Landscaping had the tools and crew to handle major residential projects. Still, most Sunny Meadows homeowners did their own basic yard work or hired individual contractors for small jobs. In March 2019, just weeks after Karen's election to the HOA board, something was about to change in Sunny Meadows. New leadership meant new priorities. And those new priorities would soon collide with Margaret's peaceful retirement in ways she never could have imagined. The woman who had spent 11 years creating something beautiful was about to discover that beauty, in the wrong hands, could become a weapon. The first sign of trouble came disguised as routine HOA business. On March 15, 2019, just 2 weeks after Karen Westfield's election as president, residents received an email notice about an emergency board meeting. Emergency for what? The notice didn't specify. Buried in small print at the bottom was a single line. Landscaping rule modifications will be discussed. Margaret lived right next door to the community center where HOA meetings were held, but she never saw the notice. At 72, she wasn't someone who constantly checked email, and the physical posting that should have gone up on the community bulletin board somehow never appeared. Only 7 people attended that meeting in a community of 847 homes. In 20 minutes, those 7 people voted to rewrite the landscaping section of the HOA rules completely. Gone was the original language, allowing homeowners to plant flowers and decorative plants without approval. In its place, a new requirement that all landscaping must conform to an approved plant list and strict height restrictions. No plant could exceed 36 inches in height, no climbing varieties, no dense plantings that obstruct sight lines. The new rules included a grandfather clause for existing landscaping, but only for gardens that had received prior board approval. Since the old regulations hadn't required approval, virtually no existing gardens had it. The trap was elegant in its simplicity. Margaret knew none of this when she walked out to get her mail on April 3rd and found the envelope that would change everything. Violation notice, unauthorized landscaping, was printed in bold red letters across the top. Her hands shook as she read the details. Your rear yard landscaping violates community standards, Section 4.2.1, plant height restrictions, and approved species requirements. You have 30 days to remove all non-compliant vegetation. Failure to do so will result in daily fines of $50. Failure to comply may result in liens against your property. Margaret read the notice 3 times, certain there had been some mistake. Her garden had won community awards. The HOA had celebrated it in newsletters. She walked back to her roses, measuring stick in hand, and felt her heart sink. 43 of her 47 bushes exceeded the new height limit. Her climbing roses, the pride of her garden, would have to be destroyed. The woman, who had never raised her voice in anger, sat down in her patio chair and cried. But Margaret Chen hadn't survived 30 years as a head librarian by giving up easily. She spent the next 2 days researching, digging through every HOA document she'd kept since moving to Sunny Meadows. The original 2008 rules were clear. Her garden was completely legal when planted. She drafted a careful, professional response letter citing the original language, her community awards, and what seemed like obvious grandfather protections for existing landscaping. Karen Westfield's response arrived 5 days later. 2 sentences. Community standards have been updated to reflect current board priorities. Compliance is mandatory with no exceptions. Margaret tried calling the HOA management company. They referred her back to the board. She tried calling Karen directly. The call went to voicemail. Her follow-up message was never returned. As the 30-day deadline approached, Margaret's stress was consuming her. She'd lost 15 pounds and was barely sleeping. Her daughter in Seattle begged her just to comply, to replant with smaller varieties. But Margaret couldn't bring herself to destroy something she'd spent 11 years creating. Those roses weren't just plants. They were her therapy, her purpose, her connection to a life that still had meaning. May 15th arrived. Margaret's garden remained untouched. The first $50 fine notice appeared in her mailbox that afternoon. Day 2, another $50 notice. Day 3, the same. By day 7, Margaret owed $350 in fines for the crime of loving roses. The psychological warfare was relentless. Every single day, a new reminder that her beautiful garden was now considered a violation. Margaret's neighbors started to take notice. Janet from across the street knocked on her door with concerned questions. Word spread through the community that the woman with the famous rose garden was being fined daily for landscaping violations. People were confused, then angry. Margaret's garden was one of Sunny Meadows' most beloved features. But Karen Westfield was just getting started. On day 14, with Margaret's fines totaling $700, a new notice arrived. This one was different, typed on law firm letterhead. Notice of lion intent. The HOA wasn't just collecting daily fines anymore. They were threatening to put a lien on Margaret's house. The letter spelled out the escalation in cold legal language. Continued non-compliance would result in a property lien being placed against the property. If the lien and accumulated fines weren't paid, the HOA had the right to force a sale of the property. Margaret could lose her home over roses. That night, Margaret called her daughter in tears. "I don't understand how this happened. I followed every rule. I've been a good neighbor for 11 years. Now they're threatening to take my house." Her daughter's response was immediate and decisive. "Mom, we're getting you a lawyer." But even as Margaret began to fight back, the harassment was escalating in ways she couldn't have imagined. Karen had started what could only be described as surveillance patrols. Every morning at 7 a.m., Karen would walk the perimeter of Margaret's backyard, phone in hand, taking photos of the violations. She measured plant heights with a telescoping measuring stick. She documented every new bloom, every climbing rose that dared grow another inch. The psychological pressure was crushing. Margaret had gone from tending her garden in peaceful solitude to feeling watched, judged, and violated every time she stepped outside. Her morning coffee routine, once the highlight of her day, now felt like a performance under hostile scrutiny. Other neighbors started reporting similar harassment. Anyone with landscaping that might violate the new rules received visits from Karen, measuring stick in hand. But Margaret's garden remained the primary target. The daily fines continued. By day 20, Margaret's total had reached $1,000. Day 25, $1,250. On a fixed income, the financial pressure was becoming impossible to bear. Then, Margaret discovered something that made her blood run cold. While researching property records for her attorney, she stumbled across Karen's real estate listing. Karen's house, the one directly behind Margaret's garden, had been on the market for 10 months. The listing description mentioned privacy concerns, and neighboring property maintenance issues as potential drawbacks. Margaret found the online reviews from potential buyers. Comment after comment mentioned being distracted by the elaborate landscaping next door and feeling like Karen's yard looked boring in comparison to the neighbor's roses. One reviewer had written, "The garden behind this property is absolutely stunning, but it makes this backyard look like a desert wasteland." The pieces were falling into place. This wasn't about community standards or landscaping rules. This was about Karen's inability to sell her house because Margaret's garden made it look inferior by comparison. But Margaret was about to discover that the situation was even more sinister than she'd imagined. Because Karen Westfield hadn't just targeted Margaret's garden out of spite, she'd targeted it for profit. And the evidence was hidden in HOA financial records that wouldn't see the light of day until a lawyer forced them to be made public. As day 30 approached and Margaret's fines climbed toward $500, she had no idea that Karen's husband owned the landscaping company that had been positioning itself to handle emergency vegetation removal for non-compliant properties. She was unaware of the text messages between Karen and her husband discussing the revenue potential of forced landscaping removals. Margaret only knew that her peaceful retirement had become a daily nightmare. Her financial security was under attack, and the community she'd called home for 11 years now felt like enemy territory. But she was about to learn that sometimes the worst betrayals reveal the most profound corruption. And sometimes, when you're fighting for roses, you accidentally uncover crimes. David Rodriguez had seen plenty of HOA disputes in his 15 years as a real estate attorney. Still, Margaret Chen's case made him angry in ways that surprised him. When Margaret's daughter hired him in June 2019, he expected another routine property dispute. What he discovered was systematic elder abuse disguised as community governance. His first move was a records request. Arizona law requires HOAs to maintain transparent financial records, meeting minutes, and correspondence. Karen Westfield's initial response was telling, a 2-week delay, then heavily redacted documents with entire pages blacked out. When David threatened legal action, the real records finally arrived. What he found in those boxes would destroy the reputations of 3 people and send shockwaves through the HOA industry. The smoking gun was hiding in a folder labeled Emergency Landscaping Services. Karen's husband, Mike Westfield, owned Desert Bloom Landscaping. Since Karen's election to the HOA board, Desert Bloom had received $47,000 in contracts from Sunny Meadows HOA. Contracts that had never been put out for competitive bidding. Contracts for emergency vegetation removal services. That would only be needed if homeowners were forced to rip out existing landscaping. But the paper trail got worse. David found email exchanges between Karen and Mike that read like a criminal conspiracy. "The Chen property alone is worth at least $3,000 in removal fees," Karen had written. "Her roses are massive. We'll need the excavator for the root systems." Another email, sent the day after Margaret's first violation notice. "Phase 1 is working perfectly. She'll never fight back. Seniors never do. Once we force compliance, we can expand to the other problem properties on Oak Street." The corruption ran deeper than landscaping kickbacks. Karen had been using her position to target homes that competed with her real estate listings. Margaret's garden wasn't her only victim. It was just her biggest prize. 3 other homeowners had received violation notices for landscaping that made nearby properties look inferior. All 3 were located next to houses that Karen was trying to sell. David's investigation revealed a pattern of fraud that made his stomach turn. Karen had manipulated HOA rules to benefit her real estate business and her husband's landscaping company. She'd turned community governance into a personal profit machine, with senior citizens like Margaret as the primary targets. But David saved the most damning evidence for last. Hidden in Karen's personal email account, which he'd subpoenaed, was a message that would seal her fate, sent to her business partner 3 days before the rule changes. "Don't worry about the Old lady with the roses. I'll handle the HOA situation. New rules go into effect next month. She won't fight back. Seniors never do. We'll have the full asking price on my listing within 60 days. Margaret had never seen such hatred in her. Life is what she witnessed in Karen Westfield's eyes when that email was read aloud in court. The courtroom confrontation began on October 15, 2019. Margaret had never been inside a courtroom before. Still, the packed gallery told her this case had become about more than roses. Local news crews filled the back rows. The Rose Garden. Grandma's story had gone viral in Phoenix, turning Margaret into an unlikely symbol of HOA overreach. Karen arrived with the most expensive HOA attorney in Arizona, a man who'd built his career defending association boards. He was confident HOAs won these disputes 90% of the time. Homeowners rarely had the resources or stamina for extended legal battles. Judge Patricia Morrison had different ideas. She'd read every document in the case file, including the damning email exchanges. Her opening remarks set the tone. This court takes allegations of elder abuse and systematic fraud very seriously. We'll be examining not just the landscaping dispute, but the broader pattern of conduct by the defendant HOA board. David's opening statement was precise in its surgical manner. Your Honor, this case isn't about roses. It's about corruption, elder abuse, and the weaponization of community rules for personal profit. The evidence will show that Karen Westfield used her position as HOA president to target vulnerable homeowners, including the 72-year-old plaintiff, to benefit her real estate business and her husband's landscaping company. But it was the evidence presentation that turned the courtroom into a theater of justice. David had prepared visual displays that made the corruption impossible to ignore. Karen's own text messages, blown up on 60-inch screens for everyone to see. Financial records showing the flow of money from HOA accounts to her husband's company. Email exchanges discussing Margaret as a revenue opportunity and a pushover senior. The most devastating moment came when David presented the timeline. On one screen, Karen's real estate listing, which is struggling to sell because buyers keep commenting on the neighbor's superior landscaping. On another screen, Karen's election to the HOA board. On the third screen, the rushed rule changes target Margaret's garden. The correlation was so obvious it felt like watching a crime unfold in slow motion. Karen's attorney tried to argue that the rule changes were legitimate community governance and that all homeowners were treated equally. But David had prepared for this defense. He pulled up photos of other gardens in Sunny Meadows that violated the new rules but had never received violation notices. All were owned by Karen's friends or potential real estate clients. The courtroom gasped when David presented the enforcement map he'd created. Properties receiving violation notices formed a perfect pattern around Karen's real estate listings and her own home. The selective enforcement wasn't random. It was strategic targeting of properties that interfered with Karen's business interests. Then came Margaret's testimony. This 72-year-old woman, who'd never spoken publicly about anything controversial, stood up and delivered words that silenced the entire courtroom. I moved to Sunny Meadows 11 years ago to heal from losing my husband. My roses became my therapy, my purpose, my connection to beauty in a world that had become very dark. I followed every rule, paid every fee, and attended every meeting to which I was invited. I won awards for the garden, which they now call a violation. I've watched children's faces light up when they saw my flowers. I've shared cuttings with neighbors and taught young families how to grow their own roses. Her voice strengthened as she continued. But this was never about landscaping rules. This was about greed. This was about people who saw a vulnerable senior citizen and decided to steal from me. They didn't just steal my money through illegal fines. They stole my peace, my joy, and my sense of safety in my own home. They turned my sanctuary into a battlefield. The courtroom was dead silent as Margaret concluded. I've lived 72 years without ever asking anyone to fight my battles for me. However, what happened to me will likely happen to other seniors if these individuals aren't stopped. My roses will grow back, but some things, once destroyed, can never be repaired. Karen's attorney called no witnesses. There was nothing left to defend. The jury deliberated for exactly 37 minutes. When they returned, the foreman's voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. We find in favor of the plaintiff on all counts. The defendant, HOA, and board president Karen Westfield are guilty of elder abuse, selective enforcement, conflict of interest, and systematic fraud. The damages awarded to Margaret totaled $15,000 for emotional distress, legal fees, and garden restoration costs. But Judge Morrison wasn't finished. She issued additional penalties that would reshape HOA governance throughout Arizona. Karen Westfield was permanently banned from serving on any HOA board in the state. Her husband's landscaping company was barred from receiving HOA contracts countywide. The Sunny Meadows HOA was placed under court supervision for 2 years, with all rule changes requiring judicial approval. But the judge's final words delivered the knockout punch that made Karen Westfield's face go white with shock. The evidence, in this case, suggests criminal fraud that exceeds this court's jurisdiction. I'm referring the financial evidence to the Arizona Attorney General's office for investigation of potential felony charges. Margaret had sued over roses and accidentally uncovered crimes that would follow Karen Westfield for the rest of her life. The news vans arrived at Sunny Meadows the morning after the verdict was announced. Margaret Chen, who had lived quietly for 72 years, woke up to find reporters camping outside her gate, all wanting to interview the Rose Garden grandma, who had taken down a corrupt HOA board. The story had everything journalists loved: a sympathetic victim, clear villains, David versus Goliath drama, and a satisfying conclusion where justice actually prevailed. Margaret's first television interview, conducted in her restored garden 3 months after the trial, became the most watched local news segment of 2019. Standing among her thriving roses, many now taller and more beautiful than ever, she spoke, with the quiet dignity that had carried her through the entire ordeal. I never wanted to be famous for this, she told the reporter. I just wanted to tend my flowers in peace. But sometimes fighting for something small teaches you that you're actually fighting for something much bigger. The interview went viral nationally. Margaret received thousands of letters from homeowners across the country sharing their own HOA horror stories. Garden clubs invited her to speak. Legal organizations used her case as a landmark example of HOA reform legislation. A documentary crew spent a week filming in her garden for a feature about property rights and elder abuse. But the real satisfaction came from watching the dominoes fall in Karen Westfield's life. Within a week of the verdict, Karen's real estate license was suspended pending investigation by the Arizona Department of Real Estate. The state board had received dozens of complaints from former clients who realized they'd been manipulated by someone willing to abuse seniors for profit. Her business partner dissolved their agency, citing irreconcilable differences in professional ethics. Mike Westfield's landscaping company collapsed even faster. Word spread through Phoenix's tight-knit contractor community that Desert Bloom had been involved in an HOA fraud scheme. Legitimate property management companies canceled contracts overnight. The Better Business Bureau received numerous complaints, prompting it to issue a public advisory warning homeowners about the company's practices. The Westfields' house, the one Karen had been so desperate to sell, finally found a buyer in December 2019. But not at the price Karen had hoped for. After 8 months of negative publicity and legal fees, they sold for $70,000 below their original asking price. The listing agent's notes mentioned, seller motivated by legal judgments and pending criminal investigation. Because Judge Morrison had been serious about referring the case to the Attorney General's office. In February 2020, Karen Westfield was arrested on felony fraud charges. The investigation had expanded beyond Margaret's case to examine the entire pattern of HOA manipulation and kickback schemes. Prosecutors charged her with elder abuse, conspiracy to commit fraud, and violation of fiduciary duty. Mike faced similar charges for his role in the landscaping kickback scheme. The criminal trial wouldn't begin until late 2020, but the plea negotiations told the story. Karen's attorney approached Margaret's lawyer about a settlement that would include full restitution, public apology, and community service, working with elder abuse prevention programs. The woman who had called Margaret a pushover senior was now begging for mercy from the grandmother she'd tried to destroy. Margaret declined the settlement. "Some people need to learn that actions have consequences," she said, "and other seniors need to see that fighting back is possible." Meanwhile, Sunny Meadows was transforming in ways no one had anticipated. The court-ordered supervision of the HOA meant that residents finally had a voice in their community governance. The emergency meeting where Margaret's garden was targeted became a cautionary tale that is now studied by HOA management companies nationwide. New transparency requirements mandated that all board meetings be properly noticed, recorded, and made available to residents. But the biggest changes were cultural. Margaret's victory had inspired other homeowners to speak up about years of accumulated grievances. Janet, from across the street, revealed that she'd been intimidated into removing fruit trees from her backyard. The Henderson family admitted they'd spent $3,000 replacing perfectly healthy desert landscaping because of threats of violation. Stories poured out of a community that had been living in fear of petty bureaucratic tyranny. The new board election, in March 2020, drew the largest turnout in Sunny Meadows history. Margaret's next-door neighbor, a retired teacher named Patricia Santos, was elected president on a platform of community collaboration, not intimidation. The first official act of the new board was to reverse all landscaping rule changes implemented during Karen's tenure. But they didn't stop there. The new board created the Community Garden Excellence Program, encouraging diverse and creative landscaping throughout Sunny Meadows. They established an annual garden tour, with Margaret's roses as the featured attraction. They partnered with the County Extension Office to offer free workshops on desert gardening, water conservation, and sustainable landscaping practices. Property values in Sunny Meadows increased by 12% in 2020, driven partly by the positive publicity from Margaret's story, but mostly by the genuine community pride that had replaced the previous atmosphere of fear and compliance. Margaret became the unofficial ambassador for this transformation. She hosted monthly garden wisdom sessions in her backyard, teaching her neighbors the techniques she'd perfected over the course of 11 years. Children who had once peeked through her fence were now regular visitors, learning to identify different rose varieties and understanding the patience required to grow something beautiful. The roses themselves seemed to thrive on the attention and vindication. Margaret's garden, now in its 12th year, reached new heights of beauty and complexity. Garden magazines featured her story and her techniques. The Arizona Rose Society gave her a Lifetime Achievement Award. Visitors came from across the Southwest to see the garden that had sparked a legal revolution. However, the most meaningful outcome was the ripple effect that extended beyond Sunny Meadows. Margaret's case became required reading in law schools, studying HOA governance and elder abuse. The Chen Standard entered legal vocabulary as a measure for evaluating selective enforcement and conflicts of interest in community associations. Dozens of states introduced legislation requiring more transparent HOA governance, directly inspired by the corruption Margaret had exposed. The National Association of Home Builders revised its model HOA documents to include stronger protections against arbitrary rule changes and selective enforcement. Property management companies have begun offering training programs on ethical governance and the legal risks associated with targeting vulnerable homeowners. Margaret started receiving invitations to speak at legal conferences, homeowner advocacy, meetings, and senior rights organizations. Her message was always the same. Age doesn't make you powerless, knowledge makes you powerful. And sometimes, the most important fights are the ones you never expected to have. 3 years after the trial, Margaret received a letter that brought tears to her eyes. A 90-year-old widow in Oregon had used Margaret's story to successfully fight an HOA attempting to force her to remove a memorial garden dedicated to her deceased husband. Your roses gave me the courage to save my memories, the woman wrote. That letter joined hundreds of others in Margaret's growing collection of correspondence from homeowners who had found strength in her example. Each one reinforced the truth that her battle had never really been about landscaping rules. It had been about the fundamental right to live with dignity and beauty, free from arbitrary persecution. Karen Westfield eventually pleaded guilty to reduced charges in late 2020, receiving 2 years of probation, substantial fines, and a permanent ban from any HOA-related activities. Her husband's company never recovered. They moved to another state, leaving behind a community they had tried to exploit and control. Margaret, now 75, still begins each day at 6 a.m. with coffee among her roses. The garden has expanded to include varieties from around the world, many of which were sent by admirers who heard her story. A small plaque near her front gate reads, "The Chen Garden, where beauty defeated bullies." But the real victory isn't measured by legal judgments, news coverage, or even the stunning roses that continue to bloom year after year. The real triumph is visible every morning when Margaret walks through her garden, no longer looking over her shoulder, no longer measuring her plants against arbitrary rules, no longer afraid that loving something beautiful might be used against her. Sometimes, the most minor fights teach the most valuable lessons. Sometimes standing up for roses means standing up for every person who refuses to let bullies disguised as officials steal their joy. And sometimes, when you're 72 years old and think your fighting days are behind you, you discover that your most crucial battle was beginning.